Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, February 15th, 2024. This week's Torah portion is the Parsha of Terumah. The order of the Parshios, the Torah portions in the second half of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, which is where we are now, the order of these portions is very problematic because there are four portions that deal with the Mishkan, the building of the sanctuary. I just have to say, before we moved to Montreal, which has been such a blessing in our lives, it's now over 22 years, before we moved to Montreal, I would always translate the word Mishkan as tabernacle. That's the way it normally is translated. But once you move to Quebec, you cannot use the word tabernacle in polite company. If you don't live here, it's an inside joke. So the sanctuary that was movable, that went along with the Jewish people during the 40 years in the desert and into Israel, and eventually 400 years later became permanent with the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, built by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. So there are four portions. By the way, in a normal year, they're read on two Shabbosos. But this year is a Jewish leap year, so it actually covers four separate weekends. So Terumah, this week's portion, Tetzaveh, and Vayakel, and Pekudei. So that's a total of four portions that deal specifically with the Mishkan, with the sanctuary, the building of it, the putting it into place, the measurements, the details, the materials, and they form one continuous unit. The problem is those four portions are not continuous because they are interrupted by the portion, the Parsha of Ki Sisa. Terumah, Tetzaveh, Ki Sisa, and then Vayakel Pekudei. Now, that interruption of the portion of Ki Sisa is even stranger in that all four portions about the building of the Mishkan are a direct response to the central narrative of Ki Sisa, which is the building of the golden calf, the Egel HaZahav. That is, the portion of Ki Sisa tells us the narrative after the Jewish people heard God speak at Mount Sinai. 40 days later, they built the golden calf, with the terrible aftermath of that. And one aftermath, a positive aftermath, was that they started to build the Mishkan. God commanded to build this Mishkan, which they started the day after Yom Kippur of that year. So the logical order would be, let's go back a couple of weeks. Yisro, the giving of the Ten Commandments. Mishpatim, civil law. We discussed several reasons why that's the one that follows. Then Ki Sisa, because in the narrative order, Ki Sisa is 40 days after Mishpatim. Remember, the Parsha Mishpatim contains civil law, the judicial system, but it also contains the narrative, a second narrative of the revelation at Mount Sinai. So that should be followed by Ki Sisa, which happened 40 days later. And then, as a result of the golden calf in Ki Sisa, we should have the four portions about the Mishkan: Terumah, Tetzaveh, Vayakel, Pekudei. That would make logical sense. Why is it that we have this order? Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twerski explains that this curious order of the Torah portions is to thematically place the building of the Mishkan directly after Mishpatim, last week's Torah portion, which deals primarily with the judicial system and the laws. And he explains as follows. Building the Mishkan in our Torah portion begins with these words. God says to Moshe, Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yikhu li Terumah. Speak to the Jewish people and take for me an offering, a donation of all the different materials that are needed to build this thing. So it starts with asking for donations of materials. But by having this portion directly after Mishpatim, last week's Torah portion, Dr. Twerski writes, the Torah means to convey that the gifts being offered for the building of the Mishkan are acceptable only if they were acquired honestly, by observance of all the laws that concern acquisition of property, as discussed in last week's Torah portion, the Parsha Mishpatim. And we need this this thematic connection, because there are quite a number of misguided individuals who engage in unscrupulous business practices, God forbid, and, in Dr. Twerski's words, cleanse themselves by making contributions to charitable causes. Unfortunately, this is not a rare occurrence, I'm ashamed to say. The Torah rejects this view categorically. In fact, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the greatest halachic authority of the previous generation, wrote that if a person does something that is lacking in business ethics, in whatever way, and then uses that to make a donation to a charitable cause, a worthy charitable cause, the fact that they are doing it to a worthy cause makes their sin worse. It doesn't lighten the sin. Well, I gave the money to tzedakah. How bad could it be? I used it for a good cause. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, it makes the sin worse. Because in addition to the sin of stealing, taking another's property, not paying taxes, whatever the crime is, in addition to that, there's also a secondary issue of Chilul Hashem. You desecrated God's name. Somebody might think, God forbid, that this is how religious Jews act, and claim some kind of higher purpose for it because they're giving it to charity. It's a Chilul Hashem. It's a desecration of God's name. The fact that you are making a donation, it's worse because of what you're doing. A number of years ago, this is going back maybe, 30, 40 years ago, there was a big scandal in the Jewish world when it turned out that many mezuzah parchments, especially mezuzah parchments that came from Israel that had a stamp on the seal that said that they were kosher, many of them were found to be fake. Many. And there were many Jewish homes who learned that they did not have a single mezuzah in their home. Every single mezuzah was treif. It was invalid. And it was a terrible Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. It was a terrible thing. So at that time, there was a meeting of rabbis in Monsey, New York, to try to deal with the fallout of this terrible scandal. And the rabbis came up with a plan, because in Monsey, there are many families, Baruch Hashem, thank God, with large families. Large families means lots of doors in the house, which means lots of mezuzos. If it turns out that every mezuzah in your house is invalid, you have to replace them all. It's a lot of money. Obviously, you understand, a kosher mezuzah is more expensive than a treif mezuzah, obviously. It's a lot of money. How are people going to be able to afford this? And it's a sudden expense. You have to put up the mezuzah right away. So the rabbis in Monsey came up with an idea that they were going to set up a loan fund, a gemach, a Jewish loan fund for this purpose. You can borrow money from this fund, interest-free, to be able to buy mezuzos, kosher mezuzos for your home, and then you have to pay it back over a certain amount of time. That was the plan that they came up with. Present at the meeting was the greatest leader certainly in Muncie and probably in the Jewish world at that time, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. And he spoke last. And he said, I agree with everything that's been said. But I have one suggestion about this loan fund that you're going to set up. It's a good idea. But please make sure that you announce, when you announce this loan fund, that you should only borrow money if you will be able to pay it back on time. Because the sin of not paying back a loan on time is worse than the sin of not having a mezuzah on your home. You know, we often distinguish between mitzvos that are between one person and another, bein adam lechavero, and mitzvos that are between ourselves and God, bein adam lamakom. But the truth is, it's a false distinction, because every mitzvah that relates between one person and another is also a mitzvah that relates between ourselves and God. We cannot serve God through a lack of honesty towards others. It doesn't work. And further, when it happens, and unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say it does happen, when it happens, we must call it out. We've discussed before that in general, there is a prohibition of lashon hara, to speak negatively about other people, even if it's true, when it's true, to say something negative. The one exception is litoelis, when there is some positive, constructive purpose. Someone wants to inquire about another person about possibly making a marriage proposal, and you know that there's an underlying fault that is not being that is not obvious and is not being revealed, and it would seriously impact the marriage, you're required to say what it is. Okay, there are guidelines of what to say and how to say it, but you're required to speak up. Listen, please, to the words of the Ritva, one of the classic commentators to the Talmud from the medieval period. He says that if a Torah scholar has been found guilty of wrongdoing in a financial issue, God forbid, it is necessary to publicly condemn it. There's no sin of lashon hara. On the contrary, that's considered lashon hara litoelis, for a constructive purpose, in order that others do not think such behavior is somehow excusable through noble motivations. No. Stealing is stealing. Lying is lying. Doing it for a worthy cause doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. And so only after learning and absorbing Mishpatim, the portion about laws and honesty and business ethics, only after we know that can people be asked for a donation. So this week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Terumah, as I mentioned, begins the longest single subject in the Torah, building the Mishkan. It spans 5 Torah portions. As I mentioned, 4 of them deal with it directly. There's one in the middle. So it's a span of 5 weeks that we'll be talking about the Mishkan. And it contains a multitude of fundamental lessons about Judaism and Jewish life. And I want to share one with you now. This is partially based on a lecture I heard from Rabbi J.J. Schacter. When we look at the entire structure, the courtyard, the building, the utensils, where everything was placed, how it was used, when and who used it, when and who saw which parts of it. When we look at the whole thing, it's clear there is a hierarchy, which we could diagram as a pyramid. Everything, the layout, the material, everything leads to the Aron, to the ark. The Aron, the ark, contained the luchos, the 2 tablets of stone, on which were engraved the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. And that was the focal point of this entire project. The Ramban, Nachmanides, writes that the reason God commanded building a Mishkan, and later a Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and later, once the first and then the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, what we refer to as Mikdash Ma'at, our synagogues, which are in a miniature form, a replacement for the Beit HaMikdash, for the temple, which is altogether a giant chunk of Jewish history, Jewish theology, Jewish practice. All of that, says the Ramban, is to take the moment of Matan Torah, God's revelation at Mount Sinai, that moment of revelation where God spoke directly to the Jewish people, to take that moment and to elongate it, to perpetuate it, so that revelation is not a one-time event in the past, but rather a process that is happening constantly for all time. Now, we discussed this recently in connection with the Torah reading in synagogue during the synagogue services. But you see that everything leads to the Aron, the ark, the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. It all leads back to that. Everything focuses on the Aron. Everything supports the centrality of the Aron to this entire enterprise. Fundamentally, we see this in our Torah portion at the very beginning. The Aron, the ark, is the first object that's described, even though it was not the first object that was built, and it was not the first object that was set in place. But it is the ultimate goal of everything else. Now, all of that highlights a deep problem in its construction. We read in this week's portion as follows. Very close to the beginning. God says to Moshe to tell the Jewish people, Va'asu Aron, make an ark. Now, this Aron is going to hold the 2 tablets of stone on which are engraved the Aseret Dibros. Again, it's to take that moment when the 10 Commandments were spoken by God to the Jewish people and to elongate it. So this now becomes the focal point, the Aron, which holds the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. One more time. Va'asu Aron, make an Aron, an ark, which, by the way, the word Aron in modern Hebrew means closet, but it means a box. It's a box. Atze shitim, of acacia wood. And it gives the dimensions. V'tzipisa oso zahav tahar mibayas emichutz titzapenu. So there's a box made out of wood, and there is a layer of gold on the inside, and a layer of gold on the outside. So in fact, when it was finished, you didn't see any wood. It was plated, covered with a thin layer of gold. So hold on a second. This is the most important object. It's the purpose of this entire monumental project. We know they had plenty of gold taken from Egypt, as we discussed a few weeks ago, and as they're going to use a lot of it to build the golden calf. That was pure gold. Why get cheap and make it gold-plated instead of solid gold. You're talking about the most important object of the whole thing, the purpose of the whole thing. And there was plenty of gold. The other utensils, the menorah was pure gold. The other utensils, pure gold, solid gold. Here's where we're going to save some money. Here's where we're going to get cheap with the Aron, the most important thing of all. If it's the most important object, do it right. Do it solid gold, not gold-plated. What's going on? There's a classic commentator titled Das Zikanim, who writes the following words. Roy haya ha'aron liyazahav kulo. The appropriate thing would be for the Aron to be solid gold. El lefi shahaya nasi b'kasef v'chavde yosu midai. But the problem is, when they traveled through the desert, it was carried. And it was carried on the shoulder of 4 people. Well, if it would be solid gold, it would be very, very heavy. And it will be hard, even for 4 strong people, to be able to carry such a load. And therefore, God said, make it out of wood, which is lighter, gold-plated. God says, compromise the magnificence of the most precious object in order to be sensitive to the human effort needed to carry it. God figured out a way to make sure that this supreme goal, that the Aron, the purpose of the whole thing, was accessible and not too difficult to uphold. And this is a lesson for every one of us in every area of life. First, obviously, service to God can never come at the expense of insensitivity to others. Just like, as we said before, it can never come at the expense of dishonesty. But insensitivity to others can never be a way to serve God. I've told this story before. There was a man who was known in his shul for coming to Schacter, to the morning service every day, and coming on time. By the way, that's 2 separate things. Number 1 is coming every day. Number 2 is coming on time. They're both very important. We have such people at ADATH, thank God. We could use a few more. If you'd be willing to join us, we'd love to have you. Okay. One day, this man came late. And since it was so unusual for him, after the davening, after the prayers were over, people asked him, what happened? Is everything okay that you were late today? So unusual? So he said to them, told them the following story. He said, I was on my way to the synagogue, on time, like always, and there was a Jew who was crying. And this Jew was hungry. And so I stopped to give him food. And that's why I came late. The other people said, wow, what a beautiful mitzvah. What a privilege to help someone in need like that. And the man said, yes, it was a privilege. And the Jew who was hungry and crying was my baby son. And my wife was sleeping. And so I let her sleep, and I fed the baby. And that's why I was late. So I want to be very clear. Coming to shul on time is important. You should come to shul on time. You should come to shul, and you should come on time. But not when someone else is in need of your help. That's when you should come late. Okay, that's the first lesson from this. But more generally and more fundamentally, we all need to make sure that every person can access Torah and Judaism and Jewish life and connection with God with as little difficulty as possible. Every one of us needs to try to remove or at least lower the barrier to full Jewish participation for every person. Of course, within the bounds of Jewish law. But this includes accessibility of our building, being sensitive to different levels of language, different levels of Jewish knowledge, different abilities, both physical and emotional, and generally to ensure that every single person is made to feel welcome and valued. In every single prayer service we have, every single Torah learning that we have, all the programming, every event, every program, every activity that happens, everyone deserves to be fully included. Everyone deserves to lift the Aron, that it should not be too heavy for them. And so we have to make sure, with our architecture, with technology, with pedagogy, and most importantly, with our attitude and sensitivity and creativity in a comprehensive way, so that we make sure in every meaning of the term that it's not too heavy. A gold-plated Aron is just fine if it allows more people to carry it. The Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, has a famous approach to aphorisms and folk sayings, which are often quoted in the Talmud. And the Talmud will often quote the folk saying or aphorism and then show the basis to be a verse from the Torah. And according to the Rav, these aphorisms expressed by non-scholarly Jews in everyday life express deep, fundamental lesson about Judaism. And it demonstrates how intrinsically anchored even a simple Jew is in the wisdom of the Torah. So one of these is based on our Torah portion, the Parsha of Terumah, and the Haftorah for this Shabbos, which comes from Sefer Melachim in the Book of Kings. So the Talmud says as follows. There was a man who used to walk around, and he had an aphorism, a saying that he would often repeat. And the aphorism goes like this. He was talking about marriage. He was talking about himself and his wife. He used to say, when our love was strong, we could have lived together on the edge of a sword. Now that our love is not so strong anymore, we need a much bigger place to contain both of us. So Rav Huna, one of the scholars of the Talmud, said that's actually a reflection of two verses in the Torah. The first from our Torah portion. The Torah says in our Parsha, near the beginning, God says, you'll make this Aron, the ark, right? The central focal point. There was a lid, a top to the box, and the lid had two solid gold kruvim, cherubs, angels, that were facing each other with wings outstretched so that they formed like a canopy. So there was a space about this size, just approximately, maybe a little bit larger, like this size. And the Torah says, God says, V'na'arti l'chasham, I will make myself known to you there V'dibarti itcha me'al hakaparas, and I will speak to you from that space on top of the lid. This space created by the two kruvim on top of the Aron, from that spot I will speak to you. It's a relatively small space. Uksiv, but then there's another verse. And this is the verse from our Haftorah. It's from Sefer Malachim, the Book of Kings, that discusses the Beit HaMikdash. 450 years later, approximately, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, finally built a permanent Beit HaMikdash, a magnificent structure in Jerusalem. No longer a temporary, movable sanctuary, but an edifice. V'habayis asher bana HaMelech Shlomo LaHashem shishim ama arko. This was 60 cubits long. That's 120 feet long. That's a big, big building. Much, much larger than that little space from where God spoke originally. And then finally, there's a third verse. And this is from the prophet Yeshayahu, the prophet Isaiah, who's speaking at a time of spiritual decline of the Jewish people. And he writes, Ko amar Hashem, this is what God says, Hashemayim kisi. The heavens are my seat, v'ha'aretz hadom ragli. And the earth is my footstool. Ezeu bayis asher tivnu li. What kind of house do you think you can build for me? After the people had sinned, even the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, which is so much larger than the original Mishkan, even that space was not large enough to contain God's presence. As time goes on, there is more grandeur, but there's less intimacy. Now, that's a statement about marriage. There's a lot of truth in that, and we need to find ways to combat that. And that simple meaning is the message of this song. I've shared this with some of you before. It's a great song. It's called Little Room by White Stripes. White Stripes is a rock band. If you have the chance, you can look it up on YouTube and listen to this song. It's quite a powerful song. But the words go like this. Well, you're in your little room and you're working on something good. But if it's really good, you're going to need a bigger room. And when you're in the bigger room, you might not know what to do. You might have to think of how you got started sitting in your little room. Or, as our rabbis teach us, mar b'nechasim mar b'daika. The more possessions we have, the more worries we have. And it's true for all too many of us. As we get older, our passion may not be as sharp. Our intimacy lessens. We each need our own space. Like Rodney Dangerfield, who said about his marriage, we sleep in separate rooms, we eat at separate times, we take our vacations apart, we're doing everything we can to save our marriage. But Rav Soloveitchik sees in this a much deeper and more sublime message. He quotes the Medrash. Our rabbis tell us, when God commanded Moshe to build the Mishkan, Moshe was afraid. He was frightened. How could it be that God would be contained in something that I and other human beings build? How is it possible? He was frightened at the prospect of somehow human beings creating something that would contain God. And God answered him and said, According to our rabbis, Lifa'amim, God said to Moshe, sometimes, Ani yored, I descend, God says, I descend, umitzamtzem es atzmi, and I contract myself. I pull myself back. God promises to limit himself, so to speak, to practice self-effacement in order to allow for an ohel moed, a tent of meeting built by human beings, to be a place where God and human beings can meet. Now, we've discussed this before in different contexts. This act of tzimtzum, of retraction, is responsible for creation. Because the Kabbalists ask, those who are engaged in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, they asked, we say in Tehillim, Molo kol haaretz kvodo. God's glory fills the entire universe. So where was there room to create a world and everything in it? It was already filled with God's glory. And they answer, the first act of creation was tzimtzum, God pulling back to make space into which the universe could fit. Rabbi Riskin says that when he was the rabbi of his congregation in the Upper West Side, New York, before he went on vacation, he would say to his congregation, I'm going to practice tzimtzum. I have to retract, I have to pull back in order to be able to create and provide what I need to provide. But the Rav says that this principle is much wider than just a Kabbalistic way to understand creation. He said, this is a central virtue, the main principle of Jewish morality. This is what Judaism requires of a Jew, to be capable of retreating. Any mitzvah can be classified in this way. Shatnez, there's a mitzvah in the Torah, we're not allowed to wear a garment that has a mixture of wool and linen. People criticize and say that this makes no sense. Why not wool and linen? You can have wool and cotton, you can have other mixtures. What's wrong with wool and linen? There's no logical reason for it. And people criticize and make fun of Jews who observe such a thing, the Rav says. But, says the Rav, but it's required of a Jew to surrender their will and judgment to God. I suspend my logical judgment, he said. I surrender my dignity as a rational being to be entitled to a rational explanation. I practice self-effacement when I observe this mitzvah. The Rav gave another example. On Yom Tov, holidays, there's a mitzvah v'samachta b'chagecha, to rejoice on your holidays, and to a lesser extent even on the rabbinic holidays. The Rav told the story that his wife passed away on Tainus Esther, the fast day on the eve of Purim. The Rav said when he buried his wife, he buried part of himself. And the truth is, in a very deep sense, the Rav never recovered from the loss of his beloved wife. And he said of that experience that he had to cry. He had to sit on the floor. Besides the fact that it's part of the laws of mourning, it was redemptive. It was cathartic. It was therapeutic. He had to do so. And then Purim came that night. He had to get up from Shiva. He had to withdraw from himself and what he needed at that moment. But he retreated. He was mitzamtzem. He pulled himself back. He gave another example. Lulav and esrog on Sukkos. We have 4 species, a lulav, an esrog, the 4 species, hadas and a rava. He told the story once, this is back in Europe. His father had spent a fortune to be able to purchase one set of lulav and esrog. It was very, very rare in those times. Very, very expensive. He said his father treated it like a baby. He put it in a case so nothing would happen to it. But his little sister took it out and she dropped it. And she was hysterical because she understood what she had done. She understood the loss and what it would mean to her father and the rest of her family. And the Rav says his father was silent. He didn't say a word. That's tzimtzum. To retreat for peace. To make room for the boundaries and the dignity of another. To pull yourself back. That is tzimtzum. So the Rav explains there are 2 spiritual movements. There's a movement forward to advance, to be aggressive, the desire to grab. That movement is acquisitive. It's self-serving. I put myself and my own needs first. That movement is never cathartic. But there's a second movement, to withdraw, to hold back. That is always cathartic. It's sacrificial. God, by creating the world, did a sacrificial act. Not aggressive, but an act of surrender. Now, this is the basis of one of the main contributions to Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, by the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who lived in Tzfat in the 1500s. We've discussed this before. The greatest Kabbalist in the last 2,000 years, for whom everything in the world, everything in history, is in some way an expression of tzimtzum, of contraction. And this is the basis of shalom bayis, of harmony within the home, of a positive, harmonious relationship between husband and wife or any close relationship. I've quoted this before a number of times. We say in our prayers at the end of the Amidah, at the end of Kaddish, we say this line, Oseh shalom bimramav, God who makes peace in the heavens, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, make peace among us, Val Kol Yisrael, and peace among the entire Jewish people. Let's say Amen. Let's say Amen, because we really, really need this. We have the practice that before saying that line, we take 3 steps backward. Because to make peace, sometimes you have to retreat. You have to make room for the other. You have to respect and appreciate something outside of yourself. If it's all about me, there's no room for you. When our love was strong and we contracted to make space for each other, our intimacy was deepest and our space was smallest, just the space above the Aron. But as we start to put our own needs and wants first, the intimacy declines and the space we need grows. And the grand building Shlomo built, even that was not enough. Until finally, we left no room for God. So God left no room for us. In every area of life, we should strive for tzimtzum, this retraction, this pulling ourselves back to make room for another. I want to share with you one last piece tonight. It's something that's very, very important to me because it is the first Torah lesson that I shared in Montreal almost exactly 23 years ago when I came for Shabbos. The first time I came to Montreal to interview for the position of Rabbi of ADATH. Now, of course, on that occasion, I wanted to make a good impression. But I also wanted to be clear about who I am and what I want to accomplish as a rabbi. So, in a sense, this message was my mission statement. And I hope 23 years later that it still is. So the Parsha, our Parsha this week is the Parsha Terumah, description of the objects to be built and placed in the Mishkan. Every object symbolized a different aspect of our relationship with God. We'll study it more in depth over the next number of weeks. And the first one, as we've discussed so far tonight, is the Aron, the ark. V'asu Aron. Make an ark, and the ark will contain the two luchos, the two tablets of stone, on which are engraved the Aseret Dibros. Again, as we said before, the whole goal and purpose and pinnacle of the entire enterprise. The Torah goes on to say as follows: V'asisa badei atzei shitim. You should make poles, long poles, made out of wood, and they will fit into 4 rings. V'yatzakta lo arba tabosov. So on the 4 corners of this Aron, this box, this ark, you have a ring, 4 rings, and v'asisa badei atzei shitim. You make long poles of wood, v'tzipiso sam zahav, and you cover them in gold plated again. Ve'vesas habadim b'tabos al talos ha'aron, and you put one pole through 2 of the rings, 1 on either side, laseisis aron behem, in order to carry. Remember, it was carried on the shoulders of 4 people. How do you lift it up? Well, you have rings, 4 rings, 2 poles. The poles go through the rings, so you have 4 people to lift up the poles. That's how you lift it up and carry it. Makes sense? And by the way, the same features on every other object. The shulchan, the mizbeach, it had rings and poles, and you put the poles through the rings, and then you lift it up with the poles. That's how you carry it. So all of these things had these badim, these long poles that were used to lift and to carry. But the Aron was unique. In distinction with all the other objects. Concerning the Aron, it says, B'tabos ha'aron yiyu abadim. Put the poles through these rings. Lo yasur mimenu. Never take the poles out of the rings. Now, very strange. All the other objects, the poles, once you set it down, you take the poles out and you put it in storage. The poles are only needed when you're traveling. When it's time to travel, you take the poles, put it through the rings, and then you can lift it up and travel. When you reach the destination, the poles were removed because you don't need them. Because these poles had they had a utilitarian purpose, to be able to carry it, to lift it, and to move it. When you weren't moving it, it served no purpose, so it was put in storage. But concerning the Aron, and only the Aron, lo yasur, you're not allowed to remove the poles, even when it's stationary. Even when it was invisible. Because in the Mishkan, and then later in the Beis HaMikdash, the Aron was placed behind the paroches, the curtain, which was the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. No one entered except the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So no one ever even saw the badim, these poles. But our rabbis explain that the badim, the poles, were just a little bit longer than the space of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, of the Holy of Holies. So the ends of the poles pushed against the cloth of the paroches, of the curtain. And they were visible, the impression of these poles pushing through was visible from the outside. So even if you couldn't see the poles themselves because they're behind a curtain, you could tell that they were there because they were pulling out. I want to try to say this in a respectful way, but this is what our sages say. It may seem a little shocking, but this is how it's described, that the poles were like a certain part of the female anatomy that was visible pushing against the garments. So even if you couldn't see the poles, you had to always know they were attached in place. Why? Why just for the Aron? So I've shared this piece with some of you before in a different context. There's a pasuk, famous pasuk, later in the Torah, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. The Torah was commanded to us through Moshe, Morashaki las Yaakov. It is an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. Our sages say, Al tikri morasha, don't read the word morasha, which means inheritance, ella mu'urasa, engaged, one who is engaged to be married. Now, our rabbis don't mean to say that there's a mistake in the text. Our rabbis mean to say that you should look at this word morasha as if it is a double entendre. It has two separate meanings. You could read it as if it is morasha, which means inheritance, or mu'urasa, one who is engaged to be married. What in the world do these two interpretations have to do with each other, have to do with the Torah? Rabbi Yosef Monk gives the following explanation. He says, many of us think of the Torah as morasha, an inheritance, like an elderly relative. We love this relative. We respect this person. We go to visit them. We pay our respects. We stay a while. And then we take our leave. And for many of us, sadly, that's our relationship to the Torah. We hear it read in the synagogue on Shabbos. We celebrate on Simchas Torah, and then we leave. We respect it, but we leave. But that's not what God wants. God wants the Torah to be mu'urasa, like a loving spouse who wants to share every moment of life with us. The Torah doesn't just want to be visited and venerated occasionally, while remaining irrelevant to the daily substance of our lives. That's not what the Torah wants. That's not what God wants. What God wants is the Torah to be a constant companion, a guide illuminating every facet of life. Not just how we observe Shabbos or keep kosher, but how we go about our professional lives. The Torah has something to say about how we go on vacation, how we love our spouse, how we raise our children, how we care for our parents. The Torah has to move. It has to go with us wherever we go. The Torah has to come with us in every single room of our home. And if we leave our home, every single place that we go. And that's why the badim, the poles by which the Torah is carried, by which the Torah is kept movable, by which the Torah is relevant and not relegated to the side, the badim must always be in place because they're not just utilitarian for the purpose of carrying, they are essential to the identity of what the Aron is. That the Torah accompanies us through our lives, everywhere, at every moment, in every place. And that's why the badim for the Aron, the poles for the Aron, could never be removed, even when the ark was stationary. Because that is what nourishes us as Jews and keeps us alive as Jews, just as a baby is dependent on its mother for nursing, for nourishing, keeping it alive. That is precisely what the Torah does for us. Let me give you a dramatic example of this. When we go to the synagogue and the ark is opened, we stand up. That's what you do. Let me share with you a point of Jewish law. It is not necessary to stand up when the ark is opened. It's not true. The reason that we open the ark at certain times in the service is to make an announcement. You should stand up. You should stand up because whatever the reason is, we need to stand up. So instead of having the rabbi say, please stand, we open the doors to the ark, which is a signal. You're not required to stand because the ark is open. It's a signal. It's as if we're making an announcement. Please stand. When we carry the Torah, then we are required to stand. When we put the Torah down, then we're allowed to sit. We don't have to stand either. In other words, we always respect the Torah, we always revere the Torah, but when it's moving, that's when we have to stand. That's a higher level of respect. And that's why it's so important that the badim, the poles, be in place at all times, because it is when the Torah is moving with us, beside us, accompanying us, that it is fulfilling its true purpose, its true role. On that Shabbos morning at ADATH, 23 years ago, I said to the congregation, you and I, we're on a date. You and I are courting each other. And it's understandable that we want to make a good impression. But it's even more important when dating. We must be honest. And so I said, if you know nothing else about me, I want you to know that I want to keep the Torah moving. I want to take a journey with you, accompanied by the Torah everywhere we go. I intend to keep the Torah out of the ark. I intend to keep the poles firmly in place at all times. And I can promise you, and I said this 23 years ago and I repeat it today, I will not always go in the right direction. And I will not always understand what the Torah demands of us. And even when I do understand, I will not always live up to those demands. But I will try my best to keep the badim, the poles, in place and moving beside us at all times. My friends, I wish you a beautiful evening and a wonderful Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.